A brand new series today called Forgive, and I like to read, and every once in a while I read a book that I think, man, God has done so much in my heart through this book, or whatever it was I was reading, in this case a book, that I feel like I need to do a series on this at City Church. And so you guys know kind of how I often preach is often what God's doing in my own heart. I get to stand up here on the stage and kind of tell you about it, and this is one of those occasions that I had read a book. It's a book by a guy named Tim Keller, who wrote a book on forgiveness that was released last year, or the end of last year, first of this year, that I read, and it just really kind of wrecked me, the principles in this book. And so a lot of what I have learned through that study and then additional study, it was kind of formed into this series that I decided I want to do here at City Church. I often say that my preaching style, I like to read and absorb a lot. And really, I just kind of get up here and talk about what God has taught me through a lot of different people. Like Devin doesn't have a lot of original ideas when it comes to sermons and delivering to you. I feel like what I'm really good at is when God gives me a lot of stuff that I've learned through a text or a book or a book of the Bible, that I'm able to kind of take what God has put into my heart through a bunch of other people and resources and then kind of communicate that to you in a Devin way. And this is kind of that situation where God used this book, this idea from a guy that I have a deep respect for, to be able to communicate to me. And I just felt like, man, our people really need to know this. And so if you're looking for someone that can talk about this a lot better than me, a lot more in depth, and just kind of lay it out there in a way that you can really wrap your heart and soul around it, then go pick up that Keller book and let him be your teacher on this. And I'll just kind of echo what he has to say in a lot of ways. But we're going to do this series on forgiveness. And we're going to, again, open up the text every week. We do that here at City Church. We're a Bible teaching church. And so we're going to open up specific text on this idea and preach from God's truth. And I just really, again, want to encourage you to be engaged in this series. If you have to miss a week, go back and listen to it, because I think the principles taught on this subject in this series can be life-transforming. So October the 2nd, 2006, and so it's been a few years ago, a man by the name of Charles Roberts entered a one-room schoolroom in Pennsylvania, Amish territory, and he was armed with weapons, multiple weapons. He sent all the boys out of this one-room schoolroom. He barricaded himself inside, and he ordered 10 girls between the ages of 6 and 12 to line up facing the wall. And he was very angry over the death of his own daughter, and he unleashed his anger on these innocent children. He executed 5 of them and critically injured the others before turning the weapon on himself and killing himself. During that time in our history, it was one of the earliest mass shootings that involved kids. It seems like that's fairly common headline news now. But if you remember back in that time, the mid-2000s, it was unheard of. And we were stunned. Innocent girls were slaughtered. I have girls, right? I get angry like thinking about that idea. It's difficult to grasp how someone could do that, could commit such a horrendous act toward innocent children. What maybe was even more difficult to grasp through that story and through that time and the headlines was the response of this Amish community to the killer. I don't know if you remember, but within hours of this horrific act, forgiveness was on full display by this Amish community. The headlines became the acts of forgiveness that came out of that tragic event. There was one grandfather that said, "We must not think evil of this man." One father of one of the slain girls, he had a mother and a wife and a soul, and now he's standing before a just God. Now, there was a very vivid picture during that time of one man that was holding the father of this killer in his arms, and he held him for over an hour. Several from this community visited the wife and the mother of this killer to offer comfort to them, reassuring them of their forgiveness of a man who literally had just put a bullet through the head of their babies. Later, this Amish community set up a charitable fund to help alleviate the financial stress of Charles Roberts' widow. He deserved justice, and he deserved what seems to be natural hatred and a desire for retaliation. But instead, this community offered forgiveness. And it's a forgiveness that really doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense to just the kind of natural human mind on how something like this should play out. And honestly, a lot of people voiced their displeasure in how this community reacted to this event. If you watch kind of the regular media outlets, a lot of people that were interviewed and had opinions on this voiced a lot of displeasure about how this community reacted. Marie Roberts later, who was the wife of this killer, said these words: "Your love," talking to the Amish community, "your love for our family has helped to provide the healing that we so desperately need. You have touched our hearts in a way that no words can describe. Your compassion has reached beyond our family, beyond our community, and is changing our world." Forgiveness changes lives and has the potential to change the world. Our text today from Matthew 18 is one of the most vivid treatments on forgiveness in the Scriptures. It is a gripping and a tragic story. Forgiveness is a frequent topic in the teachings of Jesus, who stuns his disciples by emphatically stating at the end of this story that if we refuse to forgive others, that God will deny forgiveness to us. But doesn't his radical call to forgive seem to open the door for a perpetrator to sin repeatedly against others with no accountability? Shouldn't there be a limit to how many times one should forgive? These are natural questions. Matter of fact, Peter voices this concern in our text, doesn't he? Jesus tells this story because Peter asked that very question. Then Peter came up and said to Jesus, "Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times." This is often translated 70 times 7. Peter suggests a limit, a generous one, 7 times, but still a limit. The Hebrew Jewish writings of that day, the Talmud, required one to forgive his brother, the same person, 3 times. So Peter doubles up, plus 1, right? 7 is the perfect number in Hebrew history. To forgive this person that has sinned against me, Jesus, how about 7 times? He exaggerates the number. He jumps all the way up. And this exaggerated number in his mind should satisfy Jesus. But Jesus refuses to limit forgiveness. Not 7 times, Peter, he says, but 70 times 7, or 77, or 70 times 7 again is translated other places. Like Jesus retorts, not 7 times. And Jesus is not saying that the magic number is 49 or 490. The number implies completeness, that this is a no limits forgiveness. And to illustrate his point, Jesus tells a story. Let's break this story down. The story is introduced with this debt that this guy has. What is the debt? Well, look at the debt. Verse 23 of our text. "Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. And when he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And since," notice this phrase, "he could not pay," not that he was unwilling to pay, but that he was incapable of paying. He could not pay. his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the debt is this king who has a servant who owes him 10,000 talents. Now let me put that in perspective for us. 1 talent in that day would be the equivalent of about $10,000. So you can do the math. 1 talent, $10,000. 10,000 talents, that's a lot of money. What is the point here? Again, the point is not the number. The point is that the debt is incalculable. It is unpayable, especially for a servant. This man owes a debt he is unable to pay, incapable of paying. And when it's time to settle the debt, settle the accounts, the king demands, rightfully so, that this servant make good on his debt. But the servant is unable to pay, so he will be forced to become a slave to that king, which again would have been common practice in the first century. So we have the debt, and now let's listen to the plea of this man. Verse 26. So the servant, he responds to this unpayable debt by, he fell on his knees, imploring, the idea of begging. He implores him, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. He's incapable of paying everything, but we get the picture here. Have patience with me, I'll repay you everything, the servant implores. This idea of falling to his knees implies deep emotion and sorrow, but the plea is not just an expression of regret, it is an offer to make restitution. I will repay you. I will make restitution, which is not possible. He is incapable of paying back the debt. The man simply cannot replace the borrowed money. So he implores, he begs, he pleads. And then we have this pardon that takes place. The debt, the plea, the pardon. Servant falls, have patience with me, out of verse 27, and out of pity for him, sees this man, out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. So the pardon is out of compassion. The king forgives and releases the debt and the debtor, the one who owes it. Forgives the debt, which releases the debtor. Important point here. The king absorbs the debt himself. He takes the debt. You see, forgiveness means the cost of the debt moves from the perpetrator to you. The one to whom the debt is owed takes on the debt. Let me illustrate it for you. Friend calls you up. Hey, can I borrow your car? My car is broken down. I can't get to where I need to go. I have an emergency. I need to borrow a car. Can I borrow your car? Sure, you can borrow my car. I'm a friend. My car is just sitting in the garage. I'm not going to be using it. Feel free to use my car. Friend borrows the car, uses the car, totals the car, wrecks the car. I wrecked your car, Devin. Out of the goodness and compassion of the friend's heart, don't worry about it. Forgiven. You don't have to pay me back. You don't have to replace the car. I'm just forgiving the debt. You don't owe me anything. I will forgive what has taken place. Guess what? You're still out a car. If you want to replace the car, what happens? You have to go out and buy the car, replace a car, spend the money to get a new car, or either not have a car. So the debt that has been forgiven becomes your debt. You absorb the cost of the car. Forgiveness includes voluntary suffering. Rather than retaliating, you choose to absorb the cost. Forgiveness costs the one who has been hurt, wounded. It costs them something to absorb the weight. So we see the pardon. And then the next part of this section of this text, we see the offense that occurs that is even greater, it seems, than the first offense. Verse 28, but when that same servant, emphasis, same servant, went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay what you owe. So his fellow servant did exactly what this forgiven servant had just done. He fell down, he pleads with him, have patience with me and I will pay you. These are the words that just came out of the forgiven servant's mouth earlier with the king. Verse 30, he refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt, which, by the way, you cannot do when you're in prison. So this same forgiven servant crosses paths with a second servant who owes him the equivalent of a few dollars. The forgiven servant's debt was unpayable. This second servant actually has a debt that could be paid back. It is a payable debt. But he demands payment, and not only demands payment, he begins to physically choke him. The second servant makes the same request that the forgiven servant was just granted when he could not produce the money. The forgiven servant, instead of offering mercy, offering forgiveness, has him thrown in prison where he is unable to repay the debt. The verdict of all this, 31. When his fellow servants saw what had taken place, they were greatly distressed. And they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you? And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. So when the king is informed of the forgiven servant's actions, he summons him and he says in effect, how can someone who has experienced such lavish forgiveness have such a cruel and unforgiving response towards someone else? And he throws him into prison. And then Jesus ends this story with these unsettling words in verse 35. We'll read them again. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother, key phrase here, from your heart. The meaning of this parable is very clear. The king in this story is God. The servants in this story are us. We are the servants who owe the debt. The 10,000 talents here is the infinite, unpayable debt that we owe God. That God creates us and He sustains us and He takes care of us and provides a world for us to live in. And our response to that is that we owe Him absolute allegiance and obedience and worship. He is the creator and sustainer of life, and we owe Him our everything for that reason. But we are sinners, aren't we? Instead of absolute obedience and worship, we rebel. We have sinned against God. We have rebelled against the King. And He treats us, instead of treating us with retaliation and revenge, He treats us with absolute mercy and compassion and forgiveness. Yet the way that we treat others who hurt us falls infinitely short of the forgiveness that we have received from our King. Forgive from your heart, Jesus says. So let's talk about some of the ideas of forgiveness in this text. The first obvious thing is the difficulty of forgiveness. And it's difficult in two different ways. Forgiveness is difficult for us, one, to just receive. To receive forgiveness, to receive grace, is difficult for us. You see, our enormous debt to God cannot be repaid. We cannot earn God's forgiveness. It can only be received through His grace. It can only be given and received. It is given and received absolutely free to us. But it is hard for us to receive grace, to receive forgiveness, because we are not hardwired to receive grace. We're not hardwired to just receive forgiveness. So what we naturally do as humans is we try to earn it. We try to deserve it. We try to work for it somehow. We try to do something to repay our debt to God, this unpayable debt. We bring our feeble efforts to try to repay this enormous debt that we owe to God and somehow repay. We read this story, and this servant's kind of pathetic, I'll repay my debt. And if you know the numbers here, 10,000 talents, 1 talent equals $10,000. He's a servant, and the servant says, look, hey, just give me some time. I'll repay my debt. We look at that and we think that's absurd. You don't have the resources to repay the debt. You can spend the rest of your life working, and you'll be unable to repay the debt. So the servant's kind of pathetic, I will repay my debt in the story, listen, is equally as absurd as our efforts to try and earn God's grace, favor, and forgiveness. But it's what we do. If I do these things and I stop doing these things, or I don't do these things, and somehow God will be in my corner and my debt will somehow be forgiven. But hear me clearly, the debt is too immense. We are incapable of paying it off. But receiving forgiveness is difficult for rebels who want to earn their way. And the story reminds us that the cost of forgiveness is absorbed by the king, that our king pays the price and takes our penalty on himself. Forgiveness is difficult for us to receive, and then we all know this, it's also very difficult for us to give. You see, the shocking callousness of the servant reminds us how quickly we are to forget the extraordinary grace and forgiveness that we have received. Our hearts are bent toward retaliation, retribution, revenge, getting even. I hope they get what they deserve. It's why in the story Jesus aims for our heart. Because our hearts are bent toward retaliating, getting even. Forgiveness is difficult. We also see in this story just this definition of forgiveness, that the king defines forgiveness in the story through 4 specific actions. When you reread the story, the first thing the king does is he has the man brought to him. He names the debt, right? He says, this is the debt that you owe. Forgiveness begins with truth-telling. I owe a debt to the king that I cannot pay. We call it repentance. I am deserving of the price of my sin. It is an admission of our sin and wrongdoing. It's confession. It's repenting of our sin. And so the king brings the man to him and names the debt. There's a name for our debt, right? Paul says we're all sinners before God. That every one of us have sinned. That all have fallen short. There is the naming of the debt. And then the second action that the king takes on that helps us define this idea of forgiveness is the king has compassion. He takes pity. He, important, identifies with the perpetrator. He sees the man. He sees his struggle. He sees his difficulty. He identifies with him. And he has compassion on his situation. Again, admittedly, this is not a natural thing to do. We want to focus on how wrong the person is. We want to focus on how much they deserve to suffer. But the king sees the man not as a villain, but as someone who has his own brokenness. Sees the man, identifies with the man. And then the third step of this forgiveness, the king cancels the debt, which brings us to the heart of what forgiveness is. he absorbs the cost himself. If you speak too many words without taking a breath, that's what happens. He absorbs the cost himself. He refuses to retaliate. He refuses to make him suffer. He absorbs the cost and cancels the debt. And then the last thing we see about forgiveness here, this definition of forgiveness, is the king he lets him go. And the idea of he lets him go here, he releases him. This means that the relationship was being restored, that the man is no longer in debt to the king, that he has been set free, that he's been liberated, that reconciliation takes place, that restoration takes place. Now, hear me very clearly what I'm about to say, and we're going to dive much deeper into this in the weeks to come, so you need to be here for that. This story, this parable, is not dismissing how forgiveness and justice go hand in hand. Okay? We'll talk about what that looks like in the weeks to come. We will unpack this dynamic of forgiveness and justice and how they go hand in hand. But for this story reminds us that to forgive is to open the door toward restoration and reconciliation. Let me read how Keller summarizes forgiveness here. To forgive is to name the trespass truthfully as wrong and punishable, rather than merely excusing it. Okay? So it's not excusing the trespass. It is identifying for what it is, wrong and punishable. Continue, Keller. Second, it is to identify with the perpetrator as a fellow sinner, rather than thinking how different from you he or she is. Third, it is to release the wrongdoer from liability by absorbing the debt rather than seeking revenge. And then finally, Keller says, it is to aim for reconciliation rather than breaking off relationship forever. And we're going to explore that definition in detail as we go through this series. The definition of forgiveness. And the last thing I want us to talk about in this idea of forgiveness as we introduce this series is what we see is in forgiveness here are the different dimensions of forgiveness. Very key and very important to this idea. Human forgiveness must be based on divine forgiveness. Human forgiveness must be based, for the follower of Jesus, must be based on divine forgiveness. You see, the final sentence of Jesus here, those words that we read, that final gripping, telling sentence means divine forgiveness changes our hearts to forgive as God forgives. And here's the reverse of that. An inability or refusal to forgive speaks to the condition of our heart, which is why Jesus aims for the heart. And so there's these dimensions of forgiveness. There's this vertical dimension that God forgives us. It begins with divine forgiveness, that God forgives me. There is vertical forgiveness that enables. And then from that vertical forgiveness, there is internal forgiveness that takes place. That God grants forgiveness toward those who wrong us. And that forgiveness takes place. Not up here, not in your emotions. It takes place where? It takes place in your heart. As you receive the forgiveness of God, as you understand the forgiveness of God, there's something that happens inside of you. There's a forgiveness that takes place in your heart. You see, before you can ever forgive somebody literally and in person, before you can ever have a face-to-face with someone and offer true forgiveness, forgiveness has to take place somewhere else. It has to take place inside your heart. There's a vertical forgiveness that transforms who I am on the inside. And then the last dimension of forgiveness is that horizontal forgiveness between others. That I am able to begin to reconcile with the one who has harmed me or hurt me. That there is a restoration that takes place. You see, here's the tragic part of this story. The king's forgiveness should have made this servant a forgiver. but it does not. The king's forgiveness should have made this servant a forgiving person, but it does not. He fails to recognize the magnitude of his own debt and the enormity of the king's forgiveness. This story is not a feel-good, happily ever after story. This story is pointed. This story is gripping. It is convicting. It reminds us that most people who claim to have asked for God's forgiveness have not been transformed by God's forgiveness, and that is most evident in our relationships. That when we refuse to forgive, our lack of forgiveness holds us captive to a crippling desire for revenge, retaliation, to bitterness, to anger. And here's what's taking place. We place our own desires, our own bitterness, our own anger, our own hunger for retaliation. That takes the throne of our heart. That's what Jesus says, I'm coming for your heart. Because what sits on your heart in those moments is this desire for retaliation or bitterness or anger. And what takes place is, like the forgiven servant who goes out, grabs the guy by the neck, and begins to choke him, we begin to put ourselves in the place of the king. We become the king. We sit in judgment of others. You owe me. Give it back to me. Revenge, retaliation, bitterness. We put ourselves on the throne of our hearts in place of our king. And it becomes chaotic because the servants begin to act like the king. Who's the king in this story? It's God himself. But we, the servants, take God off the throne and we put ourselves on the throne. We respond with retaliation or bitterness or anger. We allow those things to hold us captive in our hearts. And the refusal to forgive begins to wreak havoc on our souls, which is why Jesus comes after our hearts. Let me give you good news gospel right now. What will change your heart? What will change our hearts when it comes to this idea? What will change the heart of the servant from acting like the king is grasping, recognizing, acknowledging the amazing love and forgiveness of the king, listen, who became a servant for us so that we might be forgiven citizens of his heavenly kingdom. Our king became a servant. You hear what Paul said in Philippians 2? That he left heaven and laid it aside and became a servant and was obedient to death, even death on a cross. Our king became a servant, paid our debt so that we don't have to live as kings, passing judgment on everyone else and holding bitterness and anger and resentment that wreaks havoc on our souls. We can allow the king who has pardoned our debt to rule and reign in our hearts, and we can be liberated from that stuff. We're going to break that down in the weeks to come. Let me just be really, really frank with you as we end today. I get it. Forgiveness is complicated, isn't it? Especially when the hurt runs deep. But forgiveness is essential for freedom, for liberation. And the only way that forgiveness is possible is to recognize and acknowledge the immensity of my own need for forgiveness. That my debt was unpayable. That I owed God a debt I could not pay. And he absorbed my debt on the cross through Christ. That Christ took my place on the cross and absorbed the debt that I could not pay. He paid the penalty himself. And when I acknowledge the immensity of my own need for forgiveness and I embrace the radical nature of the forgiveness that he offers through his own sacrifice, that is when I can begin begin the process of forgiving those who have hurt me, wounded me, betrayed me. It is only when I recognize I too was a rebel against my king. I too was a perpetrator. I too was someone who hurt. I too was someone who took my life in my own hands. I too am the one who turned away from the God who created me and sustained me and pursued my own way. And yet that king absorbed my debt and has forgiven me, has cleansed me, has taken my debt. And the enormity of my debt and the enormity of his grace and forgiveness is what begins to equip me to begin to forgive those in my life who have done the same. Forgive? Series has a question mark on the end for a reason. Forgive? Why should I? How can I? For the next few weeks, we will dive into these soul-cleansing, heart-liberating questions. But for today, I want to just remind us that step one through all of this, step one is simply to recognize our need for his forgiveness in our own life and to begin to embrace the forgiveness that he has offered through Christ. Are you there? Have you taken that step? Have you recognized your need for his forgiveness due to the enormity of your own sin and the penalty of that sin? And have you taken the step to embrace the forgiveness that he offers through confession, repentance, and turning to him as the forgiver of your sins? I invite you this morning. The king has paid the price for your sin so that the servants can go free. Have you embraced the forgiveness that he offers through Christ? Let's bow our heads for prayer.